It is my honor to present Dr. Noor Ali. She is the principal at Alhambra Academy in Shrewsbury, Mass. Has been a veteran teacher for 12 to 15 years in elementary and middle schools. She is assistant professor at Worcester State University and Arizona State University. Noor is actively engaged in efforts towards social justice, interfaith dialogue, community networking, and youth development. She has also served as a board member on the Shrewsbury Youth and Family Services. Noor earned her doctorate in curriculum, teaching, learning, and leadership from Northeastern University. Inspired by social justice in education, her dissertation was titled Spacemaking and Voice Finding for the Narrative of Muslim American Youth. She holds a master's in inclusion education from the University of New England and was a valedictorian for her master's in literature in English. So with no further ado, we welcome Dr. Noor Ali to present her findings.
Hey, thank you, Anne. It's great to be here. It's great to see everyone here as well, even though I can't really see you. We'll get started around the topic of social justice and experiential learning. So I'm going to go right ahead and share my screen. So we'll get started with the topic at hand today. So what we're really exploring today is applying social justice and experiential learning theory to practice. What is it and how can we engage? So first off, this session is going to discuss the theoretical foundations of social justice and also its intersections with experiential learning. So essentially what you're looking at are two major key terms over here. One is social justice itself, and the second would be experiential learning. I'm going to ask participants to really apply the theoretical foundations that we talk about today to your own projects, to your work settings, as well as the broader network that you may be a part of. So really think about the rationale. The first thing to consider today is, what do we really mean by social justice in education? And the second question to ask ourselves is, how does social justice take form within experiential learning? So that's the premise for our discussion today. First, what do we really mean by social justice in education? So take a second to reflect upon that. And then, how does social justice take form within experiential learning? So essentially applying the concepts of social justice first to education on the large scale, and then to experiential learning. I'd really like for us to reflect on these three questions that I have before we go any further. One is, I want us to ask ourselves, what is our understanding of social justice in education? Like, when you think of those terms, what are some of the major things that pop up into our minds about social justice in education? Next, narrow that down a little bit more and ask ourselves, what are some must-haves when we think about social justice in education? What are your must-haves for social justice in education? And the third question, which can either be tricky or obvious, is, what is the difference between social justice education and social justice in education? So again, what is the difference between social justice education and social justice in education? I'll walk us through a few of the parameters for social justice, because I said the key terms we're looking at today are social justice and then experiential learning. So let's first think about social justice itself and what the defining parameters are. Now, as you can imagine, there's a lot of work that's been done on social justice, and scholars have tried to define it in many different forms. And that perhaps might be a little bit of the problem, that social justice has been defined in so many ways that it ends up appearing abstract, or it may end up seeming like there is no congruence within the definitions along different parameters. So there have been discussions of social justice that are purely philosophical and conceptual. And as you can imagine, those conversations around social justice that are philosophical or conceptual tend to be abstract, and they tend to, however, be helpful because they lay down some very basic assumptions for us in terms of what social justice is. This could mean establishing equity in resources and how resources are distributed. That's a philosophical concept, right? It can also mean that there is equity in respect and recognition of all the parties that are on the table or excluded from the table. The third thing could be that there is equity in love, care, and solidarity. There is a conversation of power when we talk about social justice, and that there is equity in working and learning. Philosophical foundations have also looked at concepts around distribution of resources. They've looked at recognition of the parties, and they've looked at opportunities that are made available or not. And finally, they look at outcomes. So 4 really important things when we philosophically think about social justice: distribution, recognition, opportunities, and outcomes, right? Also think about parameters of social justice that pertain to its practical definition. And when we talk about practical definition, what scholars have talked about is education inclusive? Do we have high expectations of everyone? Are we working on developing reciprocal relationships within all community members? Are we looking at its impact that is systemic or system-wide? And are we enforcing or involving ourselves in direct social justice education? So when we think of practical terms, that's where the conversation goes. You can also imagine that there is conversation about social justice that is purely theoretical. In theory, what should it look like? There's conversation around social justice that is ethnographic or narrative. And this is really important because that's where all the storytelling comes in, right? Essentially, what is education? Education has to do with knowledge. But then we have the really important question about what counts as knowledge, right? Second, you want to ask yourself, how is knowledge being produced? Third, you want to ask yourself, how is knowledge being legitimized? And then you want to ask yourself, who benefits from knowledge, right? What are the parameters that are being set for knowledge? What kind of social representation is taking place in the classroom that is then going to be represented in the larger community as a whole? And then you want to talk about the curriculum. When you think about narrative presence of social justice, what are the stories that are being shared in the curriculum? And then, of course, a really important thing when it comes to looking at the skills that social justice provides, there are essentially 7 skills that scholars have focused on. One is that it should promote a mind-body connection. There should be facilitation within education that promotes critical thinking. There should be explicit discussion of power and privilege and oppression. There should be a belief that change can occur in society. There should be an emphasis on building an equitable community, and self-care and advocating for oneself is also a super important part when it comes to social justice. So very loosely, I know this was a lot that I threw at you, but very loosely, this is the conversation around social justice in current scholarship. And now I want us to think about social justice in education has actually touched varied aspects like program development. Oftentimes when schools think about social justice, they think about the program development. They think about their curriculum. They think about the opportunities that are made available to students. They think about their educational philosophy. They think about their social vision, and they think about their activist work. Now, I want us to take a minute and think about what comprises social justice for you, and where does your institution stand? So if you were to have this conversation about social justice in education or social justice in experiential learning, and you did an analysis of where you stand, what are some of the key things that would stand out to you? And please feel free to pop stuff into the chat box. There's an interesting question that's coming up over here. How do you remove vested interest while bringing social justice in education? That's a great question to think about. And then another big question that comes over here, Tanvi, is whose vested interest are we talking about, right? The message delivered through the hidden curriculum as well as the taught curriculum being representative not only of the population, but also of the other. That's a really important point, Marwa. Let me say a little bit more about the point that Marwa is making over here. When you think about curriculum, you've got to think about different types of curriculum, right? And oftentimes when educators think about curriculum, the first thing that comes to their mind is curriculum that is explicit. And we think about explicit curriculum in terms of the text that or the content that the students are being taught, right? What is the kind of literature? What are the kind of stories that students are being exposed to? What is the kind of history that students are being exposed to, and what have you? All of these things are explicit curriculum, things that we talk about, right? But there's also something, a really important piece of curriculum, which we call implicit curriculum, which are things that don't really need, that are not said but are implied. And a lot of this also has to do with implicit curriculum that can be purely spatial or architectural in nature, right? So for example, how is your classroom set up? Or how are the hallways set up? How is the teacher's area set up? How is the principal's office set up? Where is the principal's office located or situated, right? Where is the teacher's area situated? How are the students lining up? How are the students asking questions in class? What are the protocols for the way the questions are being asked? Those parts of a student's experience, which is a formal educational experience that students are having when they're in schools and educational institutions, all of that is the implicit curriculum that an institution holds. So there's curriculum that's explicit, that's very obvious that we're talking about, and there's implicit curriculum that is being implied, right? The way a classroom is set up, for example, has severe implications, right? Where are the students facing? Are they facing each other? Are they facing the front, etc.? That's implicit. Another really important aspect of curriculum to consider is null curriculum and void curriculum. Those aspects of the curriculum that don't make it to the conversation. And by means of null curriculum and void curriculum, that is where this deliberate othering takes place, which I'm also seeing in the chat box emerge, right? When we look at our curriculum, for example, and we read stories that are about a representative of a particular population and not representative of another population, we are engaging in this othering that is taking place at that time, right? So I always like to give this example of in North America, which is where I am. I'm in Massachusetts, right? I can tell you that in North America, high school students will have read a vast body of literature in their 12 years of schooling, right? However, if you look at the representation of different demographics, I can tell you that it is not very representative. So there is an implication that there are some parts of the population that are mainstream and others that are others, right? I'll give you another example on the power of different aspects of curriculum. High school students in the United States, by the time they've done their 12 years of schooling, probably have only come across 2 Muslim protagonists in their entire educational career till that point. So they've only read literature that has exposed them to 2 Muslim protagonists. And I'll tell you what those 2 Muslim protagonists are. One Muslim protagonist is Malala Yousafzai, because they most likely have come across that book, I Am Malala. And the second Muslim protagonist that they've come across is going to be the lead character of Khalid Hosseini's The Kite Runner. Okay, those are your 2 Muslim protagonists that they've probably come across. And what makes this choice remarkable, as in I remark on this, is that both of those Muslim protagonists are not American. And both of those Muslim protagonists are set in Muslim countries that are far away from the United States. And this kind of establishes that Muslims belong elsewhere. They belong far out in these other countries. And then what's really interesting about the Muslim protagonists in both of those texts are that they are in fact represented as fighting mainstream Muslim population. And Muslim mainstream population is represented as being oppressive, being barbaric, being non-liberal. And both of these Muslim protagonists are fighting the oppression that is understood to be normalized in those countries. Now, both of these texts, what they do for our high school students is first establish that being Muslim means being elsewhere. Second, being a Muslim protagonist means you are fighting against the mainstream oppression that exists, and because that is the norm. So you can see that there are a number of stereotypes that are established in this choice of literature. Now we can say that the literature is chosen because it has Muslim protagonists and it's showing Muslims in a good light. But you can see that it is showing exceptional Muslims in a good light because it's normalizing everything else that's over there. So there are lots of different aspects of curriculum that are in play over here: implicit, explicit, null, void, and all of those in between. And that's why I asked the questions that I asked in our reflection, which is when we think about social justice in education, you can see that social justice touches different aspects of how we develop our programs, the curriculum, the opportunities that we make available to our students. What is the educational philosophy that we have for our schools if you're administrators? What is the philosophy that you have as curriculum developments if that's where you're at? What is your philosophy if you are a classroom teacher? On how you want that representation to come across, and what is the social vision that you have. So very important for us to consider this. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is the second key term of today's presentation, which was experiential learning. And when we think about experiential learning, it's really important for us to look at what its defining parameters are. And what's really interesting is that educational theories are often called out for being theory rich, but experience poor, right? So you have a lot of educational theories and people are gonna say that this conversation is theoretically powerful, but practically not of consequence, or poor practically, because it doesn't show us these implications. The reverse is often made true when we talk about experiential learning or we talk about project-based learning. And when we talk about experiential learning, it is oftentimes in academia criticized as being not grounded in theory, as in it is experience rich, but it is theoretically poor. and it is not grounding itself in in all of the other things that require to be a part of it. Now, really important for us to think about over here is, what is pedagogy? When we talk about pedagogy, what is pedagogy? Pedagogy is the study of teaching and learning. Now go a step beyond and think about what critical pedagogy is. Critical pedagogy leads that question about teaching and learning and asks you instead, how does one teach, right? What is being taught? And then how does one learn, right? So how is that teaching taking place? How is that learning taking place? And what is it that is being taught, right? That is really the goal of critical pedagogy. And many times what we see is we see theories that pertain to action, like this should be an actionable, or we have theories that define what action is currently taking place. But rarely do we see a congruence between solid educational theories and practice in experiential learning itself. I'm gonna take us over here in my next slide and talk about social justice from practitioners. One thing that is really important for us to consider is social justice education is education that is centered around themes of social justice, okay? And for we are all very familiar that when we talk about education, we always talk about what are the parameters of your educational theory, right? Is education meant to be teacher-centered? Is education meant to be student-centered? Is education meant to be content-centered? Or is education meant to be social justice-centered? So those are some loaded questions that I'm asking, and I'd like to see if we can plug something into the chat box over here around that. When we think about education, do you really perceive it? How do you perceive it? As something that is teacher-centered? As something that is student-centered, content-centered, which is knowledge-centered, or social justice-centered? So 4 things. And I'll plug them in the chat box as well. Wow, we're seeing some really interesting commentary coming up there. Yeah. Okay. Yep. What is versus what it should be? You could say that. Okay. So the question that I'm asking you is really an age-old question. It's not a new question. It is the question that has always been the center of educational theory, right? So we go back in the day to John Dewey, and even before that, these have been the central questions that educational theorists have always asked. Like, how is education disseminated? What is the purpose of how it's being done? What are the roles that all of these different aspects play within the educational setting? And of course, traditionally, education, or, well, I don't want to say traditionally because that's very debatable. Let me define the terms. A teacher-centered educational setting is going to be where the teacher is the one who is leading the conversation, and it is understood that it is a teacher who is the one who is responsible for disseminating knowledge. Okay, so if all the power is vested in the hands of the teacher, the way that educational experience is going to be shaped is going to be heavily colored by the approach and the vision that that teacher has, right? And you might see this in you know, I'm seeing some comments about different countries and how you might notice differences across the globe. And yes, that as an accurate observation to make. I myself have been a teacher and a student in many different countries, and you can kind of trace how education is done differently in different places. But a teacher-centered classroom, when you walk into a teacher-centered classroom, you can tell it's a teacher-centered classroom because all the students are going to be facing the teacher. They're all going to be facing the front. The person who's going to be doing most of the talking is going to be the teacher, right? So kind of like a lecture approach as opposed to interactive, right? And the teacher's word is going to be the final say. And there's not questions being asked that are exploratory in nature, but questions are being asked that are more rhetorical in nature because the answers are already present and understood, right? And of course, power dynamics do impact all our relationships. That's true. A classroom that is student-centered is where the lens shifts from the spotlight from the teacher moves over to the spotlight to the students. And you see the geography of the room very differently then, right? The students there might not be a front of that room. There might not be the front of the classroom in a room that is student-centered. You might see students sitting in clusters or groups and more collaborative work happening. You would not see the teacher at the front of the classroom. You would perhaps see the teacher walking around the room, facilitating conversations or learning or asking questions that the teacher themselves might not have closed answers to, okay? Of course, the pandemic has forced us to recreate the geography of the space. And this is it's actually a paper that I'm working on the impact that the pandemic is having on the curriculum of our school spaces. But if you remove the pandemic from this equation and, you know, the sneeze guards and the face shields and the must face forward and the distancing from each other, if you remove that and you look at, or the online aspect of it, and you look at where the conversations are going or how the conversations are conducted, it can give you a pretty good feel of what the curriculum of a place is like. Is it teacher-centered or is it student-centered? And then, of course, another huge aspect is it content-centered? Are we there for the teacher? Are we there for the student? Or are we there for the content, right? What is our focus? And if we're there for the content, whose content? How is it being taught? What is being taught? How is it being shared? How is it being learned? And then very importantly, how is it being evaluated? How is it being assessed? What are we penalizing people for and rewarding people for, okay? And then, of course, the newest conversation in educational theory is it social justice centered? Is the purpose of education understanding that we don't go to institutions to learn knowledge in isolation? We go to institutions to embark on a journey of learning that will better society. Or are we going to schools to learn knowledge that will keep society's status quo? Are we going to learn what privilege looks like and keep it? Or are we going to learn what privilege looks like and work actively to evaluate it, to question it, to change it, and to make the world equitable? What is the focus? Schools, the work that schools do and the work that knowledge does is never in isolation, right? Schools are a representation of what society is and what society will be. And that's why having this lens of social justice in education is so, so important, because that's where we're setting the tone. You can say that it's cyclical. You can say that the status quo in society is what impacts how classrooms are colored. We can take that route, but we would be taking the backseat if we did that. So let's take a look at some of the things that I'm talking about in this slide. I talk about really important practice from practitioners, all educators in the schools in terms of social justice, is to acknowledge who is in the room. In order to truly teach our students in a way that is humanizing and affirming, we must know who our students are. We must know what their stories are, where they're coming from. teaching students or trying to reach out to students in isolation of their lived experiences is akin to invalidating their experiences. And when adults invalidate the experiences of students or set up the classroom in a way that makes the experience of some students irrelevant because it's not mainstream, that's very telling. Second, it's really important for us to start with the knowledge that our students have. Your students are coming into the classroom with prior knowledge, right? This could be embedded in cultural settings or whatever the case may be, right? Really important to start where the student is. And then third, be honest about who you are and your biases. Really important for the adults in the classroom to acknowledge their own positionality, recognizing ourselves. Many times the work of educators becomes a work of disconnect, right? Where I'm the teacher, and this is how I represent my teaching self. And I remove my own positionality. And I don't bring in the conversation of my bias or recognizing what my biases might be and then addressing them. This is the time for us to be actively anti-racist. Being colorblind, for example, is a disservice, right? It is a disservice. So really important for us to acknowledge our own positionality of where we are situated. I'll give you an example from my personal life. And it's an example that shaped the reason why I did the work that, or do the work that I do in social justice and education, is when I was doing my doctorate in education. Now you can imagine everybody who was in the program, they obviously all had done enough education to be in a doctoral program, right? So you can say that they've all had, robust educational experiences before they make it to the doctoral program. Now, in each of the courses we took, we were always asked to introduce ourselves. And when we introduced ourselves in the opening session of every course, I noticed that without thinking too hard, the first 3 courses that I introduced myself in, I would always say, hey, my name is Noor. I teach at a private faith-based school in Massachusetts. That's how I would introduce myself. It took me 4 courses worth of the same introduction of myself to recognize what I was doing. And what I was doing was essentially subconsciously invalidating my own experience in how I introduced myself. For example, I was not sharing with my colleagues that I taught at a Muslim school. And I was coloring it by saying that I taught at a faith-based school. Now, why was I doing that? I was doing that essentially because there was a part of me that felt that my experience as an educator in a Muslim school does not hold generic relevance for the mainstream. That is to say, my experience is irrelevant to most people. And this is a choice that I was making in how I introduced myself. It was in the 4th course that I took, which was a social justice course, that I recognized what the heck was going on here, right? And that's what made me think that if I, as an adult in my late 30s, in a program which is very safe, it has people who've already embarked on educational journeys and hopefully, would not undermine or undervalue me, still I had this perception that I would be undervalued. And I wasn't wrong. I'm definitely sure that if I introduce myself, it will be considered like, she's talking about an experience that doesn't really apply to us, right? But it's a choice. And we as adults model this in our lives, right, to the students. So it's really important for practitioners to be honest about who you are and the biases that you hold, And then fourth, to encourage students to question everything, including your teaching. And this can be so hard because I know teachers, as teachers, we take our work so personally that any feedback on our work, we take that as potentially a personal offense. So really important for us to open ourselves to our students questioning everything, including our teaching. The other thing I think we also want to talk about is social justice and experiential learning. So what is experiential learning, right? Experiential learning is essentially bringing aspects of learning to the table, opportunities of learning to our students that allow them to tie in this educational experience to their real lives. And here is where I think sometimes experiential learning is misunderstood or mispracticed even, is, we think that, if I'm taking my students on a field trip, that is experiential learning. Yeah, it's an aspect of experiential learning. Or if I'm taking my students to, if we're doing a dissection of XYZ, that is experiential learning. So oftentimes hands-on learning or hands-on experiences are equated to experiential learning. If it's a hands-on experience, we call it experiential learning. But I think a term that's really important in this whole conversation is to think about learning itself. You're not simply providing hands-on experiences to students for the sake of providing hands-on experiences to students. You are making those opportunities available to your students so that their learning becomes embedded and more robust. And some of the aspects that are really important in connecting and reaching that goal is to make sure that the content and the experience that our students are being provided is embedded in real life, is addressing issues that are real life. Second, very important thing, the content that we're trying to talk about over here, we make sure that it doesn't become purely a dissemination of content, but that the students develop a critical undertaking of that content. So a lot of questioning, a lot of problem solving around that. Third piece that is so important when it comes to experiential learning is reflection. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of reflection in experiential learning. And many times what educators do is they compromise on reflection to make time for action. Because action is doing, action is what you're seeing. And they want to invest the time in the action and sometimes compromise on reflection, which is not the best choice to make, because true experiential learning has a balance of action and reflection. Because it is in reflection that you are going to evaluate what you did, internalize what you did, improve upon what can be done. All of those aspects become really important. So for true experiential education, it's really important for us to have that piece of the action as well as reflection. So for social justice and experiential education, one, super important that we connect to students' lives, acknowledging and showing that you value what students are already bringing to the classroom and making that space for the students to be able to share what they are bringing to the classroom. Second, linking to real world problems and multiple perspectives. Super, super important. We cannot teach in isolation content that does not pertain to real life. So very important for us to create that crossover within real life problems, right? The classroom walls should not be barriers that bubble wrap the students from what is out there. Third, creating a classroom community. Create opportunities for students' voices to be heard. That perspective taking is so important. Take a critical look at the materials in your classroom and be sure that the materials include examples from diverse aspects of society, right? So you're representative of ethnicity, religion, gender, ability, orientation, socioeconomic status, and the like. And next, including authentic assessments. One size of assessment does not fit everyone, right? So very important for us to make sure that our experiential evaluations hit that goal. So when we talk about intersections of social justice and experiential learning, one thing that is really important is accessibility for all. And I think that the pandemic has really raised this acute awareness in terms of what accessibility for all means, especially if your school has gone remote only or it's hybrid. I'm sure that you have seen many conversations occur on equity of access. Do students have access to internet connectivity? Do students have access to, devices or technology that they're going to need? If you are asking them to do an experiment at home, will they have access to those materials? Or things like asking students to, after the summer break, asking students what they did or in the summer or what place they visited in summer is essentially a question that can be very tricky for students who did not have an experience that they would want to share with their classmates. And whereas somebody might be talking about their trip to Disney World, right? So making sure that our conversations that we're having or the asks that we're making are accessible, making sure that there is a cultural relevance within experiential learning. So you know the populations of your students best, having those conversations that are culturally relevant to them. And then third, which is my pet peeve, most important to me, is that student engagement towards causes of social justice is pivotal. So to me, ensuring that there is equity in education is a given, right? We cannot have an educational system that is inequitable. I get that we have an educational system that is inequitable, but we cannot afford it. The only people who can afford an inequitable educational system are people with privilege who want to maintain status quo. So it is very important for us to engage in disrupting this inequity within the educational system. And I believe that one of the strongest ways that you can do that is to make social justice a key component of education. Make that a key conversation point within our classrooms and our educational system. I'm going to ask another question, which is how can we create intersections of social justice and experiential learning of all students? What are some things that we can do in our classrooms that bring the topic of social justice to the table and makes it an active conversation for students? For the first thing that I really want us to acknowledge is, yes, conversations are going to be uncomfortable. But for too long, we have avoided these conversations because they are uncomfortable. Truth is uncomfortable, okay? But there is nothing we will be able to do to address this and to create equity and justice, spaces for the voices of students to come out, unless we are ready to take that uncomfortable step ourselves. Teachers are often wary of, hey, I don't want to say something that is wrong. So say it. Say it to your students that we are having this conversation and I don't want to say something that is wrong. So correct me if you feel that I said something that is wrong. That's essentially recognizing our positionality and biases and opening ourselves to having this conversation, because not having the conversation is definitely not helping us. I would like to share over here with you some of the projects that I did with my students that were embedded in social justice and experiential learning. So in some of the projects we did at my school, we were really able to marry those two things and bring to students the important realization and recognition that your purpose as students is not to learn facts and content. Your purpose as students is to learn so that you can become change agents towards creating a society that is fair. Now, what are some things you can do as 13-year-olds or even less that can make you change agents? And then we established a lot of project work that the students did around those themes. They picked up on the themes themselves. They decided on, on causes that were important to them, and really took it from there, right? So, for example, I had one student who was interested in learning about Native American people who live in Massachusetts, which is where I'm at, okay? In all of her school career, she had maybe once or twice learned about the Native American people on whose land Massachusetts now is. But she had no experience in her school career of ever connecting, with them. So she decided that that was the project that she wanted to do, and it was just beautiful how it all panned out for her, because she was able to reach out, to the community. She was able to go visit. She was able to attend events with them. She was able to. She started a whole fundraising process to help them as well. This age group that I'm talking about right now is 8th grade. Okay, so that was the equity project that student was working on in 8th grade. So she picked something that was really close at home. Okay, I had other students who worked with the next town over. There is a lot of homelessness in the next town. So the town that I'm in is a town that is, you can classify this as a white privileged town. Okay, so people over here don't believe that homelessness exists, or they don't see it, or can't recognize it, or whatever. The next town over, which is a really busy city, has a lot of homelessness, right? Like in great numbers. So some of the students said, hey, within a 5-mile radius of us, there is this social problem that exists. What can we do to address it? So took on that project, went out, conducted interviews with people within the field. So identify the larger problem first, right? Go out and conduct interviews. Then we taught them, as part of the class, we taught them how to reach out to someone. How do you send an email? How do you make a phone call when you're working on a research project like this, okay? And you're 12 years old. So really walk them through that whole process of making those phone calls, sending those emails out, setting up those interviews with people. And then embedded in this real life experience that you now know exists, this real life problem that you now know exists, doing your research and then going down on what can I do to address it? What is something that I can do to address it? And then taking on that project and trying to do something to address it. So homelessness in the next town over was one. Food waste up in Boston was another topic somebody picked up. Somebody picked up pneumonia vaccines in Africa. So decided to go, somewhere very different. Somebody had a relative who had lung cancer, and she decided to do research around that. A lot of projects around animal cruelty or something like that. So these projects that I'm talking about are not subject specific. Right, so this is a project that you could do in science, or you could do in social studies, or you could do in history or English language arts, or math, or whatever the case may be. One of the things that we talked about was You can look at the pandemic and how this has isolated people, or the inequities that it has brought about. One of the issues that we have at our school is when we get out of our school and we have to hit the main intersection, there is no traffic light there. And so the students picked up this exactly. Social justice is not discipline specific, it is life specific, right? So the students picked the problem of, it's very hard to make a left turn at that intersection without a traffic light. Okay, now what are the implications that all of this can have? You can really take this issue and take it many different ways. They learned how to petition, for example. They learned how to write letters to their town's governance on why we need a traffic light there. Then there was a meeting called townwide to address this issue. The students ended up going there and learned how to peacefully engage in stating their cause. They had done enough research on what are the different modes of traffic management that can happen in a situation like this. One of the things they did was, we took our class and they stood on the corner of the intersection, of course, where it was safe, and they collected statistical data on how many cars were coming, how long were cars stopping, all of that. So a lot of math was brought into it. We brought a lot of social studies and history and governance into it, and then a lot of writing, ELA came into it as well. So, like I said, social justice topics, when you embed them in experiential learning and you bring them into your classroom, they are going to touch aspects of your curriculum to no end. And the first step, however, is to be unafraid of, will I meet the standards? Yes, you will meet the standards, right? You will meet the standards. Don't worry about it. You're going to get to the standards, but we can definitely center the topics around themes that are based around social justice so that we can engage our students into recognizing and seeing themselves as change agents. We need an entire generation that recognizes itself as important change agents, right? I'm going to share with you, hang on one second. I'm going to share with you a project that one of our students did, and I know that I'm running really close to the end of my time here as well. So in one of the classes that we did, we centered around themes of social justice. And then I decided that I wanted the student to, all the students, not just the student, I wanted the students to create picture books around that theme, okay? Creating a picture book is incredibly difficult because it means that your word choice is going to become very small, right? You're using fewer words and you're trying to create an entire narrative story, by doing that. So I'm just gonna, give me 1 second, I'm gonna pull it out so I can see it better. Oopsies. Okay, so this story is called I Never Knew Him. And as you can see over here, I have permission to share this, just if you're worried. Here's a person in an orange inmate, and here's a child with a little soccer ball. I never knew him. So as you can see, this story is about Camp Delta, dedicated to all the victims of the detention camp at Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay. When I'm going to just reduce this a little bit so we can see the whole picture. There you go. When I was 5 years old, it happened. My mother told me that they took my father away. I wonder, that's the child looking at outside the door into the mirror. Do I look like him? Do I smile like him? Do I talk like him? Is he okay? You can see the child is growing. Is my son okay? And his mother. Why did they bring me here? I'm tired of being in the dark. I wish to see him a man. The years pass by slowly in Pakistan. They pass by slower in Camp Delta. I wish to see my father again, at least one last time. So that was a story that the student picked about Guantanamo Bay. And of course, she did a lot of research around the topic. There was an exploratory essay that she wrote. There were interviews that she conducted. And then there was this picture book that was developed at the end of it. I'm going to share one last one, which is very special to me. And then I'll call it quits from there. This one is called Bittersweet. Dedicated to all the children forced to work in the chocolate industry. My name is Huta Jalon. I am 10 years old. These are the only things I know about myself. They took me when I was young. Just get to work. That's the mantra every day. Nothing else matters to them. Little children grow old, hungry, and tired and hurt. Just get to work. I've tried several times to escape, but where does this plantation end? And what is chocolate? This dark thing. Can I try some, please? Just get to work. This dark thing. Can I taste what I've been working for? Do I even want to? Your sweet is my bitter. So with that, I'll stop and I'll let Anne take over.
Yeah, that's a very powerful ending, Noah, to an absolutely wonderful session. I know we don't have time for questions, but I had like a dozen of them that I was writing down to really help teachers. My focus was really how do we help teachers be the change agents for these students, and how do we get into the skin of the students, supposedly, to really bring about social justice. So I can't thank you enough. This has been an absolutely wonderful session. And, it is going to be recorded. You won't find it there today, but you'll find it there tomorrow under the expo session if anybody wants to go back to it. I know it's worth kind of going through a couple of times. And then just before we leave, just a couple of reminders. After I really, again, sincerely thank Noor for her wonderful presentation. Sister Noor, thank you. That's been wonderful. It opened my eyes to a couple of things. And I hope that we can bring away a lot of what you said to our classrooms and to our colleagues that we work with.
Thank you,
Again,
Anne.
thank
It was a
you
pleasure.
very much. Thank you.